now want to tell you a story about that evil instrument of the occult, the Ouija board. The tale centers around some high-spirited students who decided one night to have a game which ended in a way that none of them ever imagined. Normally at this time I would set the scene, but tonight I'll not do this because I would have to describe a Ouija board in some detail, and I would prefer not to do this in case there's anybody listening who doesn't know what one looks like and who might be tempted to try to make one if they did. So I'll be content to just say that the students were in a flat and that they were cramming for their finals. Because of the pressure of the work, 4 of them, 2 lads and 2 girls, decided one Saturday night to have a break, get a few cans of beer in, and relax for a few hours. By all accounts, they enjoyed themselves, and as happens all too often in cases like this, their thoughts and conversations soon turned to what they could do to relieve the boredom of university life and academic work. Several silly suggestions were made, like streaking through the halls of residence, to getting absolutely smashed out of their minds, to dressing up as ghosts and scaring the female students. And it was this last suggestion which led the conversation to the subject of the occult, and someone, no one can now remember exactly who, suggested that they make a Ouija board and see if there really was anybody there. So they gathered together the necessary bits and pieces to make the board, and after about half an hour or so, they were ready to try it out. They gathered round on the floor in a circle, and all put their forefingers on an upturned glass. One of the lads then asked in a suitably grave voice if there was anybody there. At first nothing happened, so one of the girls repeated the question. Again there was no response, and after the 3rd time of asking, the group of young people were beginning to get bored. Just as they were about to call it a day and think of something else to do, the glass moved. Naturally, they each accused the others of pushing the glass, and naturally everybody denied this. As they were lightly arguing about whether anyone was guilty of not taking the game seriously, the glass moved again. It went to the word yes, and almost insistently kept going back and forth to the word as if to emphasize the point. And it was at this point that they began to wonder if perhaps there was an outside agency moving the glass. One of the girls rapidly took her finger from the glass and said that perhaps they'd better not play about with something they didn't understand. But the others would have none of it. Here was a chance to have a bit of fun after all. So the lad who had asked the question first asked whoever was pushing the glass to tell them his name. Nothing happened for a few moments, and then the glass slowly moved around the board, spelling out a word. At first, they couldn't understand what the word was, so the other lad went and got a piece of paper and a pen. They then asked the glass to spell the word again, and this time it seemed to rush around the board as if it was irritated at not being understood in the first place. The lad copied down a jumble of letters which didn't make much sense, until, that is, they noticed that there were several words running one after the other without any punctuation. Looking at them, they quickly deciphered a sentence. It said simply, "I am," and at this point it spelled out a name that I will not repeat, "I have you." Well, the students didn't know what the sentence meant, nor did they recognize the name. They then asked what the entity meant by the words, "I have you." There was a pause, and then the glass spelled out the phrase, "white skin, red eyes, death." At this moment, the glass suddenly started to speed around the Ouija board as if it was possessed. It was going too fast for anyone to take down the letters. Equally suddenly, it abruptly stopped. For a few moments there was no movement, and then without warning, it suddenly shattered, showering the students with a shard of razor-sharp glass. The girls screamed in shock, and both the lads, despite themselves, began to tremble, so unnerving was the experience. Well, as you'd expect, this put a damper on the evening, and the girls got up to go back to their flat. But their troubles were not over yet. Suddenly, the room seemed to be in the grip of a freezing terror. The lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. The temperature plummeted to near zero. But worst of all, the 4 young students were paralyzed. Whether by fear or shock or even worse, they didn't know. But no matter how they tried, they were all unable to either move or speak. By now, fear had turned to stark terror. For against their will, they found themselves being turned slowly towards the window. When they were all facing the same way, they heard a deep, manic laugh which chilled them to the bone. Then they noticed what looked like a dim light appear outside the window. At first, it was just a sort of pale glow, but as they were forced to continue to look, it became brighter until it seemed to fill the room with an eerie pale blue light. Still, they couldn't move or avert their gaze. Suddenly, what looked like two deep red pinpoints of light appeared, and to their horror, they took on the shape of two eyes, slanting in an oriental way, unblinking, emanating intense malice and evil. They seemed to be looking into their very souls. But still, the horror wasn't over. Slowly but inexorably, a dark shape formed around the evil red eyes. It wasn't exactly a man, although that would be the nearest description you could apply. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, with a massive muscular torso. The arms were almost too long for the body, and the legs ended in large, misshapen feet. The whole thing was covered in a mass of red hair. The thing looked at each of the 4 students in turn, and then turned his evil gaze to the lad who had asked the questions. It slowly raised its massive arm and pointed at him. A shaft of intense blue light seemed to shoot out from the end of the arm and strike the lad, who was immediately flung across the room against the wall on the other side. He then looked at one of the girls and repeated the treatment on her. At this point, the students became aware of a loud banging on the door. The thing looked towards the door, gave a manic laugh, and disappeared. The 2 students who had not suffered at the hands of the thing immediately realized that not only were they able to move again, but that the girl was screaming at the top of her voice, although up to this point they'd heard nothing. Suddenly, the door burst in, and 3 or 4 other students staggered in. They quickly took in the scene, and then asked what had happened, as they'd heard screaming and thought that someone was being attacked. Initially, no one would admit to anything out of the ordinary. But when it became obvious that they were not believed, one of the girls spilled out the awful story to a shocked audience. Naturally, they weren't believed when they told the truth. Until, that is, they noticed several strange things. The girl and boy who had been flung against the wall were both suffering from bad burns on their arms and necks, and on the wall where they had struck it was a large scorch mark which looked for all the world like an inverted cross. From that day onwards, the 4 students were never the same. The lad who had been thrown against the wall began to suffer from terrible nightmares about the strange creature they'd conjured up. The girl who was similarly treated became quiet and introverted. The other 2 people suffered inexplicable pains in their arms for a number of weeks. One strange thing was noted by the people who had burst into the room when they heard the screaming. The makeshift Ouija board had been flung on the floor, scattering all the letters over the room, and in the midst of them were 5 letters which had fallen in such a way as to spell out a word. That word was death. The sad postscript to this tale is that the young man who had been thrown against the wall never recovered from his experience. 2 years later, he committed suicide. He left a note. It simply said that he could no longer stand the presence of the thing they had conjured up from the deep recesses of the abyss, and the only way to be free of it was to deprive it of that which it fed on, his soul. How do I know all this, you may ask? Well, I was one of the students who broke down the door that fateful night. I saw the 5 letters spelling the word death. But what convinced me that it wasn't just a silly prank which had gone a bit wrong was the name that they had copied from the Ouija board at the start, the name of the entity they had summoned from the deep. It's a name I will never speak out loud, because it represents a force which is best left undisturbed.